Hi, welcome to Maelstrom. This is a new concept that we've been developing over the past few months, talking about generational differences, where Gen Z males are now, and dialogue. My name is Barry Rutherford, and my partner is.
I am Griffin Rutherford. Great to meet you all. I'm 23 years old and I'm part of Gen Z. I'm working in AI implementations consulting right now, so some engineering work. I have interests relating to fitness, outdoorsiness, and the like.
Oh gosh, I don't know if I can add anything to that. I'm 73, although I know I look much younger. I have a degree in English literature, but I spent 50 years as a managing director, CEO, board director, did a lot of merger and acquisition work in different parts of the world. So this is my opportunity to go back to my creative roots. I firmly believe that this generation, Gen Z, particularly men, are in the most challenging time that I've seen in my 7 decades for a variety of reasons, and we'll get into that some. For Maelstrom, we see it as a way to share with you our conversations, and we realize how lucky we are because Griffin and I have always been able to talk, and we know that there's a lot of young men out there that are not in that position. So tell us a little bit, Griff, and I call Griffin Griff and Griffin. You can call him whatever you want. Tell us what you see is going on with Gen Z men in particular. What do you see are the key issues, and what's the identity right now for Gen Z men?
Right. Well, that's a big question. Where do we even start with that? So, my father's a baby boomer, and I am Gen Z. And to give some perspective, we are three generations apart. There's boomers, then there's Gen X, and then Gen Y, who are millennials. And then there's my generation, Gen Z, Gen Alpha after me, and then Gen Beta was just born this past year, which is pretty crazy. So, with that all being said, and having this
Out there, Griff.
Oh, totally. So with that divide in time and culture differences, there's a number of ways to answer that question. I think one key point is for better or for worse, there's less of a rigid definition of what it means to be a man today as a Gen Z person as things were 50 years ago when my dad was 23. We got pretty much a 50-year age gap here. So maybe you could speak on that about this changing rigidity or lack thereof of masculinity.
Well, at the core of the issues and the discussions we're going to have in the upcoming podcasts, you know, when I first started out, I had no business experience. I had a degree in English. My first job was unloading trucks at Sears. I sold life insurance, did some crazy stuff, and by coincidence, I wound up meeting someone who was an entrepreneur, and he trusted me, believed in what I could do, and made me the CEO of a company, Griff's Age, which is a ludicrous idea. But it worked for me and it created a 50-year business career. The key thing was having someone that was a role model. His name was Brooks Reed. He's in his 80s now. And he trusted me to be direct. He taught me what it meant to be a leader. I think the generation that, and I was lucky, I was very lucky and I worked hard, but the Gen Z male now, I don't think has a lot of available role models. Half of the marriages wind up in divorce. There's fewer and fewer male teachers every year. Institutions like Boys Club and Boy Scouts are pretty much gone for a variety of reasons. So there's not a lot that young men today can see as a pathway. And Griff, two key things I see that have helped create this environment we have now are the pandemic and social media. Could you speak to the pandemic and what that meant to you, how you managed through it, and how that impacted social media, contributing to the world that we have right now.
I could speak about myself, but also speak about what I believe is larger societal impacts of both topics, which are different. I have been very fortunate during COVID, which was more than 5 years ago at this point. That was during my first year of engineering school. I spent all my free time outside exploring the trails, studying, or making friends online.
Yeah, we're in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We're outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico. So we're in a unique place that has a lot of outdoor options compared to quite a few other people. Sorry, Gary.
No worries. That time for me was good. It was a net positive. That is not the case for most people who are either other Gen Zs or people of all ages. I understand struggled immensely during that time during COVID. To the point about social media and technology addiction in general, it makes sense if you think about it. If people are isolated in their rooms all day, they don't have much to do except scroll or doom scroll on Instagram or TikTok for hours at a time. So, of course, I believe, and from what I've read and from what I've anecdotally seen, the COVID situation 5 years ago further exacerbated these already existing issues of isolation and tech addiction. And I think this affected my generation in some ways different than other generations or age demographics. Less so for me, but some younger Gen Z people or Gen Alpha people had very pivotal developmental windows during the pandemic. So, if, say, elementary school, middle school, those times are very essential for making people who they are. So, if people are spending that time not socializing or being isolated, it's like a domino effect, I believe. So, there's that. And for you, how does that contrast to how you grew up? So I spoke about COVID and 2020 and kind of touched on phone, social media addiction, but there's a lot more to it than that. Do you mind speaking about your upbringing and how it's probably different than a lot of Gen Z people?
Well, yeah, different world, obviously. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. Home life or society was very different. I rode my bicycle to school every day. We didn't worry about the same things of predators and other issues. My grandparents had a farm, and I was out operating pieces of farm equipment when I was 10. When my grandfather would have a little bit too much to drink, he would have me drive his Studebaker back home, and I was probably 12 years old then. Who would let their kids do those things now? But it was very, I like to talk about the internal world and external world. My internal world was much more limited then. I mean, we had two television stations, a national newscast at 5:30 every evening and a local newscast at 10 p.m. And then at midnight, the television really went off. They put a screen pattern on and played the national anthem, and the TV went off until 7 o'clock in the morning. No one can imagine that now in our 24/7 constant information world. Libraries are important. Reader's Digest it was important because magazines were important because that was the only connection really had to the world. I think for for me, a lot of what we did was taught through participation as opposed to the internal world that we see now where social media brings things to us. There was no Title IX. There was no worry about whether you opened a door for a woman if you were going to be insulted or whether if you tried to kiss someone that was going to be viewed as being sexually aggressive. I'd like for Griffin to speak to this. Forming relationships is totally different. It's not just about social media and this virtual world. It's the way that young men and women look at each other. I've read one statistic that almost half of young men never date. Tell us about your friends, groups, and how young men and women interact now. And what do you worry about if you ask someone out?
Right.
Besides,
Yeah,
they like you.
yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Other than the fact that they may say no, they don't want to go have a cup of coffee with you. But what do you think about? What goes through your mind, and how do you guys get together?
Right. So there's a lot I could respond with that. Well, first of all, we've spoken about this in passing. My dad and I have a theory, very likely based in truth, that my generation doesn't have the same tight knit social roots that your generation had 50 years ago as young people. Instead, we're in this more dispersed, globalized world, which has pros and cons. The way that connects to relationships, whether romantic, platonic, etc., is, we have all this access to information, all this access to people, which sounds great on the surface, but what are the implications of that? Do connections actually mean? If you have all these followers or friends on some social media platform, how do those connections compare to growing up in the same hometown years ago or decades ago and really maintaining this strong set of in-person connections? So I think those are all things we could ask ourselves, whether Gen Z or other age groups. But I feel as though, whether exacerbated by the pandemic or other factors, there's less social infrastructure now. There are fewer third places where we could just go out and strike up a conversation with people we've never seen before or regulars who show up at the same place at the same time certain days of the week. We don't have that same level of infrastructure that my dad had growing up. There's a caveat. All these connections online could foster opportunity as long as we're proactive about it. We don't have that same level of in-person spaces to meet people, but if we're proactive and make the most of it, it's entirely possible to have, great either quality, quantity of connections in 2025. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're unique in that Griffin will actually want to go talk to everyone, whether they're young or old or whomever, because he genuinely is interested. I think that's very difficult for a lot of people. Even though I ran businesses for a long time, I think inside I'm probably an introvert. It's much easier for me to be in my internal world than reaching out. And Griffin does a good job at that. I do think being a man today is much more difficult than it was when I started out, partly because we didn't have the impact of Me Too. We didn't have the negative, visible male realities. It was not because we ignored it, it was just because we were stupid. If you look at what's changed in the past 15 years, the burden that a lot of young men have is the stereotype of the misogynistic absentee father who was either drugged out or drunk and violent. I see that stereotype in so many different forms of media. The men have turned into be the bad guys, insensitive, sex obsessed, disconnected. And there's a lot of reasons for stereotypes, and there's a lot of validity in some of that. But I think it's a burden that young men now carry with them and make them much more aware of that legacy of bad masculinity. A good question, Griff, is dating. It seems to me that there's more groups than there are one on one relationships. People go out and they don't really have a date, they have a group that does something. Is that true?
Yeah, there's definitely truth to that. My generation has this unique trait of having more of what people call situationships.
I've never heard of that.
Well, there you are. I'll explain briefly.
Well, tell us what situationships are.
Sure. Gen Z slang 101. How about that? We could do like a Gen Z slang
Great.
per episode, it's like a dictionary or something. So with the more transient globalized world and a number of factors, especially for my generation, there are far fewer long-term relationships and a much higher rate of people who short-term date for like a week or day and then just essentially ghost each other and never talk again. So there's this
Why?
fear
Why?
of-
Why is that?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think one is just sheer access to people. So whether it's dating apps or social media and having all these potential partners, people see all these options and through this layer of abstraction of a screen, it doesn't feel like a real connection. Subconsciously tells people that others are disposable, is what I theorize, which I assume was less of a thing when you were growing up.
Well, I think
Mm.
it was harder to ghost someone, particularly if you lived in a small town. The other thing that's out there is different perspectives about sex and sexuality. I remember I was shocked when I must have been like 8 years old, 10 years old, and I found two old Playboy magazines in my father's drawer in our house. I thought, wow. Now, you know, everyone's bombarded with online porn. There's all kinds of channels that are out there to, dig into any fantasy you've got. And I think that's part of the problem. It's twofold. One, there's this idealized view of what relationships are supposed to be, disconnected from the reality of who people really are. And I think also way more analysis. I use the deal of opening a door for a woman. You know, I've been married for almost 40 years. If I had to go back out in the world right now of men and women and dating, I'd have no idea what to do. And I can't imagine what it's like for someone that's a Gen Z. And, I think the other thing that, and we're going to get into this in more depth, the traditional roles of men were to be the provider. The woman stayed at home. My mother didn't get her driver's license until I did in high school. It's a shifting role of what it means to be a father, a husband, and a male. It's not a good or a bad thing, it's the reality. How do men see career paths and what their role should be in a relationship?
Man, I have so many responses to that.
Well, we have an infinite amount of time. We can edit this down to
Yeah, we
six
could.
hours.
Yeah. Or I could decide on what path I want to take here. So there's romantic relationships, there's careers, there's also platonic relationships. And I think all these topics have a lot of intersections between them about how the world is changing and masculinity. So there's a lot of crossover there. The world is more globalized right now than it was 50 years ago. There's pros and cons, so many externalities to that. For me personally, I just have to keep learning and adapting to this changing world. With careers, AI increased competition with outsourcing and all these variables coming together. There's definitely more opportunity to learn anything right now online, whether it's through YouTube or ChatGPT or journal articles. We have that almost infinite opportunity, but there's a lot of noise out there. Learning how to distill what's most important and find what's needed to progress your career or reach your goals. I think it's very difficult for people my age or of any background to navigate all the noise and BS. What do you think about
Yeah,
how we navigate everything into
I completely agree with you. One of the things that we'll spend an entire podcast on is artificial intelligence. If you ask me from my decades of business and life experience, what pivots have occurred in my lifetime, one was the threat of nuclear war in the late 50s and 60s. The other was certainly the advent of automation, where factories became more and more efficient. The decentralization of manufacturing, where it became a global resource base as opposed to traditional big factories in Ohio and other places. But the biggest pivot that I've seen is artificial intelligence. And it's good and it's frightening. The good side is I think it will provide a lot of benefit from the medical side to all kinds of things. The downside is it's going to take a lot of jobs away. Griffin has a Master of Science in Computer Science. And one of the things that's changed in 3 years is the advent of AI doing coding. For me, as a content creator and entrepreneur, I love chat and I love Claude and the different options because it opens up so many pathways and takes out a lot of barriers. But I think it's really frightening, and there's a lot of people between Griff's age and my age that feel disconnected, particularly if they're in roles, career paths that are going to be obsolete. So, how does Gen Z view AI? Is it a threat or is it a plus? And specifically, as a graduate computer science student, where do you see AI fitting into the STEM world?
To answer the first part, all the above. So many opinions out there about AI because it's so disruptive. So, with that comes this whole array of perspectives. And given my technical background as finishing a master's in computer science around a month and a half ago, it's very exciting. It's very cool stuff. But no one knows what AI is going to do to the world around us. People can make smart, educated predictions, but no one knows for sure. And people who claim to know what's going to happen are wrong, or they're at least going to be wrong in some ways because it's so disruptive and volatile, I believe. To address the first part of your question, my generation has a lot of responses to AI. I completely empathize with people who despise it because with image generation, someone spends hours and hours and hours perfecting an art style, and that is, they pour their heart, soul, and identity into that art style. AI is can and will be probably was trained on all the blood, sweat, and tears, and then is able to replicate that to varying degrees of success instantly. So, what are the implications for copyright law, especially when people are not being fairly compensated, I believe? And the same thing applies for other intellectual property like writing, coding, etc. So, there's complexity there. But at the same time, there's a lot of potential to help us out. I'm working on this business right now within the AI implementations consulting space. And our goal is to essentially use AI in various small to medium sized business contexts to help make work culture better and essentially cut out the busy work so business owners could focus on what's most important to them while thinking about ethics at the same time. It's difficult, and in terms of how AI is affecting the job market, the transformer architecture, which is the underlying basis of these language models, what we call ChatGPT, Claude, etc., it's all trained on tokens, little snippets of words arranged in different ways. And these tokens, are essentially billions and billions of a series of, essays, Reddit threads, articles online, or say Stack Overflow coding threads as well. So there's a lot more information on that. Therefore, these language models perform a lot better for those types of things versus, say, the nuances of a CAD design in SolidWorks. It's much harder to tokenize those concepts like 3D designs or other such intellectual properties versus those things. It currently is affecting the job market. I need to keep adapting and learning about it, but also keep considering the ethics and consider how it's affecting different industries differently. What are your thoughts as someone 50 years older than me and got your first computer when you were 26, correct?
Oddly enough, computers cost about the same now as they did back then. I think it's a complex discussion. For example, I wrote a book during the pandemic, like so many other people, and it's set in my hard drive for 4 years. And then I decided to start trying to edit it with chat, and it was great. It was able to look for not only bad grammar, but also storyline development and a lot of other things. For me, it's been a very rewarding experience as I've gotten to understand chat and the other AI agents that are out there. Before, if I looked at a project or an idea, there were so many barriers. We're going to have a website. We're going to have to have a lawyer look at this. We're going to have to do all kinds of things. And now you can overcome many of those barriers. It is complex, and it is the biggest pivot that I've seen. Hopefully, a good pivot, but we'll see. Let's wrap this up by talking about what we hope to accomplish at Maelstrom. The idea originally came to us as we were talking several years ago about the luxury that Griffin and I have of being able to talk. The more I learned from Griffin, the more I realized that it's not the norm. A lot of kids don't have a father or a relationship where they can talk about anything. So we started this with the idea of, well, we'll talk about a baby boomer versus a Gen Z male and how we see things differently. The reality came to us pretty quickly, though. It's not just about generational discussions, it's about perceptions and how we define masculinity. Because it's changed so much for me, it's changed dramatically for Griffin. And the broad discussion is, as men and women, how do we see the world and how do we operate in it? Our goal for Maelstrom, and I'll turn this over to Griffin in just a second, is to be not so much a commentator as a reporter. We hope to attract an audience who look at Maelstrom as a repository of information from TED Talks to research reports to information that is specific about Gen Z males and masculinity in general. We also plan to bring in experts and others to add more depth to our conversations. And not only men, but young men, young women, mothers, fathers, teachers, others. We're starting out in the traditional podcast format, but our website, malestrum.com, is going to be a collection of information. And one thing is the name, Maelstrom. How did we come up with that? It is a maelstrom in the traditional spelling. It's a storm that's out there swirling around, and our logo represents the male symbol with a tornado swirling around. It's not all bad. It's not all good. It is a storm that's occurring right now. And my hope is that we can create open dialogues with a variety of typical Gen Z men and women who can share what's worked and not worked for them, and maybe we can all learn something. So, Griffin, why don't you wrap up by defining your goals for Maelstrom or what you hope it can do? What's your vision for it?
Right. Well, my vision for Maelstrom would be to not only look at this storm of an ever-changing world, through the eyes of people like us, but also, as my dad said, to have this diverse perspective, both in terms of identities, but also in terms of overall perspectives, views on the world, to sort of break this trend of forming echo chambers and essentially parroting only one narrative that serves a certain purpose. We want to take a full holistic view of what's going on from an editorial perspective versus having some malicious motive.
Well, I hadn't thought of the word malicious for Maelstrom before, but yeah, certainly. We're not trying to make a political point or really make a statement as much as observe how people are operating in this very complex time. And trying to understand where we're going next. How do we evolve in a world where we may be replaced by bots sooner than later? How do we deal with a world that is increasingly connected, but increasingly disconnected? We hope you'll join us in this journey. I know I've already learned quite a bit just in putting Maelstrom together with Griffin. We're going to try to do a podcast once or twice a week. We'll be adding new content. We have a newsletter that'll have the topics we plan to discuss, as well as information. And we're also going to be soliciting other people to interview. We're going to reach out to others in the community, in the global community, to get their perspective. You can log on to us at Malestrum.com. We'll be posting some information on LinkedIn and Instagram as well. We're going to publish this on Substack and Medium. There'll be a lot of ways to connect. And we look forward to connecting with you. Griffin, do you have anything you want to wrap up?
Thanks for listening. We will be back for more conversations.